In 2023, a Spanish television show called El Condensador de Flujo, Spanish for the flux capacitor, covered a theory which has been surprisingly popular in the Spanish media for many years, the lost colony of Spanish Micronesia. As explained here by noted historian Dr. Carmen Guillen, the theory goes that there are 4 or sometimes 5 remote islands in the Pacific Ocean which, thanks to a legal loophole, are still today sovereign territory of Spain. In other words, the once mighty Spanish Empire has not fully disappeared. Remnants of it still exist, scattered across the world's biggest ocean. Dr. Guillen explains to the audience that the theory does not hold up to scrutiny, and she is correct about this, but while she is talking, graphics flash up the words bulos históricos, which most directly translates as historical hoax. And this, the idea that this theory is a hoax, is not correct. The theory of Spanish Micronesia may not be accepted by any government, it may not be valid according to international law, and it might be discredited by historians like Dr. Guillen, but it's not a hoax. It's a real theory that real people have proposed in good faith, and it's been discussed repeatedly by the Spanish media and the Spanish government since 1949. At the end of the segment, Dr. Guillen is asked what the inhabitants of these islands think of this idea that, according to some, they might live in what is still a Spanish colony. And she replies that the Spanish Micronesia theory has had no impact on anyone from those islands. Really? How does she know? Did she ask them? Despite dozens of pieces of coverage about Spanish Micronesia I've found in the Spanish media, I've been unable to find a single attempt by a Spanish journalist or Spanish government official to contact anyone from anywhere in Micronesia and ask them for their opinion. Well, we're going to change that.
Greetings from Micronesia. Come around.
Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and in this video, we're going to answer 4 questions. What is the theory of Spanish Micronesia? Why is it discredited? Why is the Spanish media so obsessed with it? And what do the people of Micronesia think of all this? For that last part, we're going to get help from my friend and fellow YouTuber Kenneth Edmund. Make sure you check out his channel, which will give you a fascinating window into Micronesian life. More from Ken later. First, Spanish Micronesia. What is it? For hundreds of years, the Spanish Empire was a truly global empire, with colonies in Europe, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. The Pacific colonies were founded starting in the early 1500s and included Guam, the Philippines, what were referred to under Spanish rule as the Caroline Islands, which today are the independent countries of Micronesia and Palau, and the Marianas Islands, which today is the U.S. territory of Northern Marianas. By the late 1800s, Spain had lost most of its colonies in the Americas, and its empire was in severe decline. Germany, meanwhile, was building its own new empire, and in 1885 attempted to seize the Caroline Islands by force. This attempt failed, but Spain was pretty cheesed off, and asked Pope Leo XIII to arbitrate the dispute. He ruled that the Caroline Islands still belonged to Spain, and crucially, he stated in his ruling which islands were part of the Caroline Islands and which weren't. This was a win for Spain, but despite this minor victory, the Spanish Empire continued to shrink, and Spain lost almost all of its other colonies in 1898. This was the year of the Spanish-American War, after which Spain was forced to cede Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, which meant that the Caroline and Marianas Islands were Spain's only remaining Pacific colonies. Spain had administered these islands for centuries, but had never really developed them or even paid them much attention, and they were now very far away from any other Spanish territory. So Spain decided to sell the 2 island groups to Germany, which still wanted them, for 25 million pesetas. And thus ended the mighty Spanish Empire in the Pacific. Or did it? 49 years later, a Spanish government researcher named Emilio Pastor discovered something he thought was very exciting. Of the thousands of islands scattered across the Pacific that Spain had once possessed, 5 islands in the Carolinas Island group, 4 inhabited and 1 uninhabited, had not been transferred to Germany in the 1899 treaty. Or so he argued. I'll explain the theory in a moment. Pastor saw this as an opportunity for Spain to establish naval bases in the Pacific, and sent a proposal to Spain's Council of Ministers, chaired by Spain's then fascist dictator, Generalissimo Francisco Franco.
Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead.
Now, to me, this is a really bizarre moment in history. Spain was still recovering from the ravages of the Spanish Civil War, and it was diplomatically isolated from the rest of the world because it had been a neutral country during World War II, which had just ended. I mean, no one had bothered to even invite them to join the United Nations yet. And in just a few years, Spain would lose control of its last remaining colonies, which were located in North and Central Africa. Its government was in no position to start consider reclaiming territories on the other side of the world, islands which since 1899 had changed hands twice more, to Japan, who took them from Germany during World War I, and to the United States, who got them via the UN from Japan after World War II. As far as Pacific colonial powers go, Spain was long forgotten. And yet, on January 12, 1949, Spain's Council of Ministers actually did consider Pastor's proposal, and after careful deliberation, they declared it is necessary to wait before taking any action with the United States or with the friendly powers that are part of the UN, since Spain has no contacts with the UN, and it would be the UN that would have to decide on the final fate of these Micronesian islands that belong to Japan. In other words, Franco declined to press Spain's claim to these 5 small islands scattered across the Pacific, not because it was an absurd, unworkable idea, but because Spain's current relations with the United States and the UN at the time were a bit frosty. That's insane. Despite Franco's decision not to proceed, Pastor did publish his ideas in a book the next year entitled Territorios de Soberanía Española de Oceania, or Territories of Spanish Sovereignty in Oceania. And this book, now available online, has ensured that Pastor's ideas lived on, especially on the internet. What is the basis of Pastor's claim? I've got to admit, I find this argument really hard to follow, but here's my best understanding. Pastor was convinced that in the 1885 ruling by Pope Leo XIII, Spain's possessions in the Pacific were defined to include Ulithi, Kapinga Maringi, and Nuquoro, all of which are today part of Micronesia, Mapia, which is currently part of Indonesia, and the uninhabited Rongerik Atoll, which is today part of the Marshall Islands. After establishing this, he then argues that the 1899 treaty that sold the Caroline Islands to Germany defined the borders of the island group differently, leaving these 5 islands out of the sale. Part of Pastor's argument has to do with a Spanish explorer named Hernando de Grijalva. Everyone agrees that de Grijalva set sail to the Pacific in 1537. Pastor claimed that de Grijalva discovered these 5 islands during his voyage, or at least some of them, as I understand it. This is a minority view. If you look up the history of these islands, most of them don't list de Grijalva as the person who discovered them. But for some reason, Pastor was convinced that because they were discovered by de Grijalva, in his view, they should not be considered part of the Caroline Islands. Perhaps because the Caroline Islands had been established as a colony a decade earlier, and maybe he thought it was too late to add more islands to the Caroline Islands. I don't know, it's pretty weird, and I found it hard to follow. Also, according to Pastor, the 1885 treaty defined the Caroline Islands as extending south to the equator, but the 1899 treaty defined it as just extending to 5 degrees north. So that would explain why he thought Mapia and Kapinga Maringi should still be Spanish. But anyway, what's important is that Pastor believed that these 5 islands had been left out of the 1899 treaty. Therefore, they never belonged to Japan, and they never belonged to the United States, and they are rightfully Spanish sovereign territory. However, even if Pastor's claims are true, and they're probably not, I think he was acting in good faith, but I don't think it stands up. But anyway, even if they're true, there are several components of international law which make this whole theory unviable. The most important of these is called the principle of effective occupation. This requires that a state must demonstrate effective administration and control over a territory to claim sovereignty. Spain barely had any administrative control over any of the Caroline Islands at any point, let alone these 5 islands, and it's had no presence at all on any of them since 1899. Spanish authorities can't just waltz into these now independent countries with a piece of paper and say, hey, on these 5 islands, guys, we're in charge now. International law doesn't work that way. But the idea of a lost colony of Spanish Micronesia, though discredited, has remained remarkably resilient, and it's been popping up in Spanish media from time to time ever since. Here's an example from the Spanish edition of the Huffington Post, which appeared just a few months ago. And it's not just the Spanish media which is keeping this issue alive. In 2014, a member of Spain's parliament, Jan Iñárritu, actually asked a question about Spanish Micronesia in parliament, asking the government of Spain to make an official ruling on the issue. The government responded with an unequivocal answer. They said that the 1899 treaty transferred all of Spain's Pacific possessions to Germany and make no claim on any of the Pacific territories that Spain once ruled. But even though this was a rejection of the Spanish Micronesia claim, the idea that a Spanish MP has asked this question officially in Parliament has been reported over and over again by the media to give the story just a hint of legitimacy. Now, Mr. Iñárritu is a member of a Basque nationalist party, so he's not the sort of guy who you think would go in for some sort of Spanish colonial fantasy. So I decided to send him an email, and I asked him, did you ask the question because you think Spain should pursue these claims on these islands, or just because you were curious to find out the official position? And he responded. Here's what he said. I did it out of curiosity after reading an article in the press. The aim was to obtain the government's position on the matter. Getting a response from a Spanish MP is pretty cool, but can you see how circular this is getting? Mr. Iñárritu's question was driven by a media story which he saw, and then he asked the question in Parliament, and then ever since then, the media has used the fact that he asked the question in Parliament to bolster continued media coverage. Why won't the Spanish media just let this story die? Well, the obvious answer is it gets clicks. Spanish people just seem to want to keep reading stories about this supposedly lost colony that maybe they still have, but actually they don't. Sometimes the chatter on the Spanish language internet gets really fanciful. For example, on one online forum, I found this message from 2006 which says, I think that sovereignty should be claimed, diplomatically speaking, and the island should be colonized again. With the millions of unemployed that we have, I am sure that more than a few would not mind starting this new adventure and giving life to that part of Spain that belongs to us by right. These islands already have people living on them. You're not going to give life by showing up as a colonizer. But anyway, on the same forum, another person wrote, I'm convinced that these 4 islands are Spanish territory, and as such should be officially claimed and occupied, because it is only fair. Spain must occupy its rightful place in the world and in future history. These are just 2 cranks ranting on the internet almost 20 years ago, so it's not a representative sample of Spanish popular opinion, but it is these voices which keep the story of Spanish Micronesia alive, helped by regular new transfusions of interest generated by Spanish media outlets. I don't actually know why this theory has remained popular for so long, but I do have an idea. Britain, France, and even Portugal lost their colonies in the middle of the 20th century over a peaceful, gradual process. In contrast, Spain lost most of its colonies over 100 years before this, mostly through violence. Many of the colonies in Latin America overthrew Spanish rule through wars of independence, and then most of the rest were taken away from Spain at gunpoint by the United States after the Spanish-American War. I can't help but wonder if the way the Spanish Empire ended has left some sort of mark on the collective Spanish psyche, which makes this idea that the empire somehow still endures so appealing. Colonization sucks. There is no justification for it. But if I'm right, if this continued interest in Spanish Micronesia is driven by some sort of collective trauma that the Spanish people endured at the end of their empire, maybe this might explain why no one, even responsible Spanish journalists, bothers to even try to talk to the people of Micronesia to get their viewpoint on the whole topic. But I'm interested in hearing from them, so let's do that now. I'd like to welcome my friend and fellow YouTuber, Kenneth Edmund, who tell us where are you now, Ken?
Yes, specifically, precisely, geographically, I'm on Pana Bay. It's one of the states within the Federation of Micronesia, and Cabingamarangi and Nukwaro. They are islands outside our main island.
It's my understanding that there are people from those islands who live on the island where you live. Is that correct?
Oh yes, that is correct. We have a massive community of those 2 islands right here on the island. They're part of us, they're family, and yes, we share the same space.
You've had a chance to speak to a few people about this. What was the reaction when you brought it up to people? Did they think you were nuts? Did they know what you were talking about?
They were astonished. They were like surprised, like they didn't know such thing exists. They didn't know that the Spain or the Spaniards still claim their islands when today in modern times they're under a different reign that other people would still claim them.
And this isn't the Spanish government. This is just some people in Spain, I should say. But it's one thing to say you're not in the country that you think you're from a different country, but you're from my country. We on the other side of the world, you're still our colony. As someone, as an indigenous person of that region, and you know people from those specific islands, how does that make you feel?
Honestly, in my own opinion, I think that is very cruel in some ways because we've been there are a lot of footprints of colonialism in our islands, and we've been under the under the powers of the colonials for under the Spain, Germany, Japan, and now we're being influenced greatly under the U.S. And for me to be in my home and someone just barging and claiming that that home is theirs, I would be I think it's a bit of a intrusion. So that's my opinion right there.
I think you're being
So
polite, but yeah. I'm originally from America, and you mentioned the America as a colonial power, which is from the UN mandate after World War II. But let's be honest, it's been an American colony. And although Micronesia is
yeah.
technically independent, I'm sure America plays an outsized role. What's your attitude towards America?
So growing up in a U.S. Influenced generation, partly I could say that there are a lot of benefits as well because we get to travel to the United States without visa. We can work there. We can go to school. We have a lot of benefits in terms of education and so forth. But on the flip side, I think some of things are being washed down. Some of things have been disappeared. Like, for instance, our culture has been like evolved greatly because of the influence that they brought in. And I would say some of our languages have been so mixed up, and we're kind of losing the tradition ways or the custom, the culture that we were brought up like originally. The culture has been, evading a bit. So there's the good side and there's the bad side. I think there's always a balance in life, and if we look at it that way, that's how I look at it.
I wanted to thank you very much for doing this, and also for taking the time to go and find people from these islands who I'm sure thought you were just off your rocker when you started talking about this.
Yeah, when you first mentioned about that, I was like, is this guy for real? So that's when you started to send me the information. I started to do a research because that was a shock to me as well. Thank you for the enlightenment. I didn't know like they still do have these theories around.
Yeah, like I say, it's not exactly mainstream. I think the Spanish media
Mm.
just finds it something they can't resist talking about. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, be sure to check out Ken's YouTube channel. I will leave a link in the description. It'll show you all about life in Ponape, especially fishing. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Ken. Well, there you have it. According to my source in Micronesia, the idea that people in Spain would be openly discussing retaking bits of their country to make them into new colonies is insulting and upsetting. I wasn't able to find anyone in the Indonesian island of Mapia to speak to, but I wouldn't be surprised if they feel in a very similar way to the way that Ken felt. So, people of Spain, I know it's just some of you, it's just a small minority, but could I just ask you, give it up. This talk doesn't help you. It doesn't make you look good. Just give it a rest. And to the Spanish media, I know this idea seems fun. It's quirky and kind of weird and slightly entertaining, but if you're gonna talk about it, just reach out to people in Micronesia. I mean, I found one. I'm just a YouTuber. I'm sure you could find someone and ask them what the people of Micronesia think of this idea. You ought to get their perspective on this. It's just common courtesy. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.